Alrighty. I apologize if the lighting looks a little weird today. Actually broke the lamp in the ceiling, so it's certainly interesting when that doesn't work as well. So I'm probably front lit and look very light from what I can tell. But hopefully I'll fix the lamp in the ceiling. But anyway, um, there's a piece I want to talk about that came to my radar. And the reason I see it is it's not every day that you see some pushback on some of the things, and I wanted to highlight it. And the pushback in question has to do with something that's referred to as positionality. And so, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, it's kind of important to talk about what that is exactly first. So this is from newdiscourses.com. James Lindsay, thank you very much for putting together a handy Woktionary, if you will, or a dictionary or encyclopedia or however you want to name it. I think, what is it? Translations from the Wokish is what he's referred to it as. In social justice theory, postmodernist in nature, positionality is where you stand by virtue of your group identity, intersecting group identity, and its relationships to the alleged power dynamics that define socially constructed reality. Put more simply, each individual is understood by social justice to be a member of a number of small social groups, usually demographic, and these groups are theorized to have a particular relationship to the various dimensions of systemic power pervading society. One's positionality is a sum total of her, relative or relational, status as privileged or oppressed along all the various axes of power, as understood through intersectionality. Intersectionality being the idea that, if you're of a couple of different groups that are supposedly oppressed, that kind of, you've intersecting oppressed groups, be it along race, sex, gender lines, or what have you. That is, your positionality is your set of various relative statuses as privileged oppressor or marginalized oppressed, which is also believed to influence your potential status as a knower. See also knowledge, lived experience, standpoint epistemology. According to social justice, one's positionality, quote, must constantly be engaged. What this entails is that one must constantly engage in a lifelong process of self-reflection and self-awareness about the ways in which one is oppressed, or the ways in one which has privilege and is thus oppressing others. Postmodernist has the whole thing of constructs a lot of false dichotomies, being that if you are in a place of privilege, well, anybody else who doesn't have the same privileges that you do are immediately oppressed or marginalized. It's a lot of false dichotomies with respect to postmodernism, and the capital social justice being sort of the critical theory version of social justice here, if you will. Let's see. A black man, for example, would assess that he is oppressed as a black person and thus has authority on that oppression, but is privileged as a man and thus lacks authority on issues related to sex and gender. That is, positionality is the foundation for praxis for intersectionality. Engaging one's positionality roughly means obsessing about these things and the impact it has on one's ability to make authoritative statements about social reality, and one is expected to do this constantly. Awareness of one's positionality and its implications is known as critical consciousness, see also wokeness. This attitude proceeds ultimately from standpoint epistemology, which is a theoretical idea that suggests that knowledge about oppression is only available by directly experiencing it. This view is a kind of Gnosticism that carries the implication that experiencing oppression confers more and special knowledge to the oppressed, which the dominant cannot directly know or fully understand. See also shut up and listen. It proceeds from valid observation about subjective experience that it then confuses for other kinds of knowledge. This is considered important not just to establish authority to speak about political issues, but also so that one can declare that one is aware of his own allegedly self-interested biases and ignorance and attempting to account for them. Yep. Let's see. In practice, this would mean, for example, that before offering an opinion, a homosexual Hispanic man would be expected to take pains to describe his identity statuses and how those position him with respect to social power dynamics. Dominance as a man, oppressed as a homosexual, oppressed by white people, but oppressor to black people as a Hispanic, and so on, including also ability status, trans status, and other identity markers. The purpose of this exercise would be to credential him through his lived experience in the system as a knower about the realities, quote, of oppression where he is oppressed, and to acknowledge and disclaim the necessary ignorance where he holds dominance. There you go. A speaker or writer's qualifications to speak or write on the issues or topics at hand will be judged based upon his positionality and what it allows. Our Hispanic friend would not be deemed competent to speak on trans issues, women, or issues of race, relevant to those deemed more racially oppressed than he is. But he could talk at length and expect to be believed when talking about the problematics of white men, whiteness, white supremacy, heteronormativity, and homophobia. The performance of engaging in one's positionality is essentially a woke ritual that, besides signaling compliance to social justice ideology, also conditions the speaker and hearers to further embrace the conclusions of theory that follow. This acknowledgement and engagement ritual precedes many or most communications, as critical race educators, including Robin DiAngelo, tells us must be intentionally engaged. Okay. So that is the long definition coming from newdiscourses.com. Thank you, James Lindsay, for putting that together. But there's a reason for me reading all of this, because one of the things that I have noticed of late in the social sciences literature than anything else has been the inclusion in the literature, in articles, of things called positionality statements. Positionality statements in the literature, basically the authors include a section of their articles describing all of these kinds of things about themselves that are, for all practical purposes, irrelevant. I have said this before, because when I do peer review myself of articles, there's only 2 times I read the author's names. The first is the first time I see the article, just to see if there's any names I recognize where I cannot review the article because it would be a conflict of interest. Conflict of interest being the idea that, in this case, you don't want to do peer review on an article when you've actively done research and written articles with one of the authors of that paper. So, like, if it was someone that I had written an article with in the past 5 years, I wouldn't review it, because that would be a conflict of interest. That's one of the reasons I read the names the first time. Then I put the paper away. And then I don't read the names of the authors again until I go in to put the names at the top of my review. Because for peer reviews, I always include the title of the article and the last names of the authors listed in their order. So that's the kinds of things I ignored. And I also, when I see them, which is rare, at least with respect to some of the things I see, but I don't read positionality statements if I get the sense that they're in there, because they are irrelevant. They are absolutely irrelevant. But this caught my attention for a number of reasons here. This is showing up in Perspectives on Psychological Science, and I suspect this article was approved for publication, because if you've been following along, you know Perspectives on Psychological Science is the home of the Fiedler on the Roof fiasco in the last few months. But I saw this article get published and I have a suspicion that it was accepted for publication probably prior to the Fiedler on the Roof fiasco unfolding, and the unfortunate pushing out, shall we say, of the editor-in-chief. So, the reason I bring this particular article up is because this is a critique of doing positionality statements in journal articles. And I saw it from the author's tweet online. And I saw the commentary and critique. Well, you can't do this because you're a bunch of, you're not this, you're not that. It helps us. Didn't engage with the arguments at all. Actually, they just reflectively said no, or at least it seemed for most of the tweets, to be fair. But why I want to highlight something like this, and I'm not going to go through all of it. There's a couple of things I will show you the key points that the authors are making about why positionality statements are stupid, effectively. to paraphrase. And the reason I want to show this is that while it is critical and important to have pushback on ideas just in terms of academia generally, or in your institutions or what have you. Understand that a lot of papers are what we all cite each other's work, right? So having this kind of thing written up for somebody to be able to refer to it, to cite it, shows that there is discussion and debate. Let's put it this way. Where most folks would be pushing back on Twitter, or having debates on Twitter, or trying to have debates on Twitter, I don't honestly think you can. The back and forth commentary in articles like this is the forum most often and most widely used for scientists of any discipline, whether it be psychologists, or physical scientists, or social scientists. This is the space where this happens quite often. And so it's great to see something like this appear to say, no, I don't think the positionality thing is a good thing. So allow us to read the abstract, and then I'll go find the actual points in question. There has been a remarkable push for the use of positionality statements, also known as reflexivity statements, in scientific journal articles and other research literatures. Grounded in reputable philosophical traditions, positionality statements are meant to address genuine concerns about the limits of knowledge production. However, there are at least 3 reasons why they should be avoided in scholarship. First, it is impossible to constitute credible positionality statements because they are constrained by the very positionality they seek to address. Second, positionality statements are unnecessary because reducing bias, positional or otherwise, in scientific literatures does not hinge on the biographical details of individual scholars, but on the integrity of the collective process of truth-seeking. Third, by asking scholars to disclose information about themselves, positionality statements undermine the very norms and practices that safeguard the impartiality of research. Instead of asking individual scholars to issue subjective declarations about their positionalities, scholarly communities should focus on improving the rules of intersubjective competition at the heart of scientific progress. In our view, the most productive path to increasing representation and reducing positional bias in research is to protect the freedom of scholarly inputs while insisting on methodological transparency and rigor. So then, positionality, right, that we have with this is certainly interesting. And you got your 3 main points here. Now, they are going to get into some interesting commentary. The purpose of the statements is to highlight researchers' cognitive limits and opportunities so that the readers are aware of how these factors may have influenced observations and interpretations reported in the study. Scholars in psychology have suggested that positionality statements embody the spirits of open science by introducing more transparency into the process of knowledge production. Let's see. Yes. And so in what follows, we begin with a brief overview of the epistemological considerations that have motivated scholars to produce positionality statements. Next, we provide examples of actual positionality statements as they appear in various literatures. Material paves the way for a detailed critique of the use of such statements in research. We conclude, suggesting a more defensible approach to managing the kinds of challenges positionality statements are meant to address. The rationale behind positionality statements is informed by reputable philosophical traditions, specifically hermeneutics and standpoint epistemology. Standpoint epistemology I don't necessarily think is one of the best things, but totally different thing. Standpoint epistemology builds on the idea that knowledge is socially situated, consists of 3 core theses: situated knowledge, epistemic privilege, and achievement. First, okay. Like I said, I can't go through all of this today because it is a bit of an article, but 3 objections. The art of the impossible. As noted, the purpose of positionality statements is to provide transparency about how authors' individual characteristics and social positions may interfere or interact with their treatment of the subject matter. So that conflicts somewhat with the new discourses definition in the sense that really it's about who has special knowledge about something and who doesn't, which is one reason I don't use it anyway, because if you're talking about universalism, I don't like them and I don't use them anyway. If you're talking about universalism, where anybody can do science, that means you could be exploring something in which you have absolutely no knowledge about it, and your social standing for whatever, or however your positionality is described, would actually have no bearing. It would actually have no bearing and no meaning on it, because it would be something that many people perhaps have no knowledge of and no experience with. That's one of the reasons I don't like positionality statements to begin with. The good faith argument in favor of reflexivity statements, positionality statements, can be summarized as follows. As humans, all scholars are products of their environment. This fact generates subjective and cultural bias in their work. Rather than pretend they are objective observers, it is better to make clear that the readers understand who they are and where they are coming from. Scholars should do their best to declare their biases and own up to their agenda. On the surface, this seems like an entirely defensible endeavor, not that different from the uncontroversial requirement to declare one's financial conflicts of interest. However, on closer inspection, the task is not so simple, and as we argue below, crafting a positionality statement becomes an exercise in futility. Disclosing one's financial conflict of interest can indeed be understood as a kind of positionality statement. After all, it is a statement about the scholar's biography that, although external to the corpus of the study, may influence the scholar's perspective on the topic. One key difference between disclosing financial ties versus providing a positionality statement is discretion. Financial interest is something scholars are required to disclose, regardless of whether this aspect of their lived experience surfaced in the process of self-reflection. By contrast, positionality statements grant authors the freedom to decide which parts of their biography they choose to share and how they choose to frame it. For example, the guidelines adopted by 2 journals of the International Association for Relationship Research state that authors of positionality statements should include whatever information, quote, you feel most relevant for the readers to know about. According to this document, quote, the goal of positionality statements is not to make individuals disclose information they do not want to disclose. What if I don't want to disclose anything because I think positionality statements are stupid? Anyway. It is relatively straightforward for scholars to identify their financial conflicts, given that can be established with documentation such as contracts and receipts. There is nothing equivalent representing a researcher's standpoint in the society or even in the literature to which they contribute. See, this is 2 different things. Standpoint in terms of society, standpoint in terms of what the hell are you studying? And where does that fit in the field are 2 very different freaking things. And that's why your societal standpoint, for that matter, may have absolutely no bearing. Crucially, insofar as researchers' positions affect their engagement with their research topic, it logically flows that this same position must also cloud how they write their reflexivity statement. Like a scale that tries to weigh itself, constructing a credible positionality statement is ultimately an impossible task. If researchers take seriously the idea that what they bring to inquiry, their social position, experiences, and so on, informs how that inquiry unfolds, then it is obvious that this would apply to their own introspection. For advocates of positionality statements, this line of criticism may seem unreasonable. Although people cannot fully escape their biography, they are still capable of considerable self-reflection. However imperfect, surely this process makes it possible for researchers to disclose something that will help the readers evaluate the limits and advantages of their lived experience. We agree. It is likely quite easy for scholars to accurately report their biological sex, their gender identity, nationality, race, ethnicity, and many other personal characteristics. However, we take issue with the assumption that these kinds of attributes, the listing of which dominates positionality statements, are particularly salient for any given study. Exactly. If there's something you're studying, how the hell does it matter whether or not you give a whole bunch of these things? Like for the physical scientists, for example, why the hell does it matter? That's one of the good reasons why it doesn't necessarily matter. But the other thing is that they're right here. If you take it seriously, that notion of positionality statements, that, somehow your experience reflects this and what have you, yeah, your experience is also going to color how you talk about your position in society, too. If you take that seriously. To appreciate the limits of reflexivity, consider the above-cited positionality statement crafted by Elliott and Reed, in which they recognize that neither poor nor black, and that they are neither poor nor black, and then testified to their awareness of the dangers involved in people like them writing about low-income black Americans. The authors went on to express their commitment to anti-racist, intersectional, and feminist principles. Why did they choose to describe their positionality in these terms rather than others? Specifically, why did they ignore other potentially salient characteristics, such as their religious convictions, personality, nationality, or academic training? Why did the authors reflect on the dangers of racial and class dynamics, but seemingly unbothered by their strongly expressed political commitments? So, contrary to what it may seem, the purpose of the example was not to criticize Eliot and Reid's research, which should be judged on its own merits. Our point is to illustrate the challenges involved in crafting a positionality statement of any kind. These kinds of statements are unpersuasive because academic scholars cannot have it both ways. They cannot, on the one hand, claim to be burdened by their biography when conducting research, and yet, on the other hand, be emancipated from it while constructing a positionality statement. Fortunately, as we demonstrate next, this inescapable dilemma is not something that needs to be solved. So, yeah, on the one hand, if you take it seriously, then you can't escape it even if you write it. And your own positionality may well have affected the crafting of your positionality statement. That is a logic that I can see there with that. But the more important thing here is what they get into with the next one. Academic scholarship is embedded within institutions that have emerged to manage intellectual competition between self-interested and fallible participants. The scientific method and the various norms and practices that guide scientific research have evolved over time to ensure, however imperfectly, that knowledge claims are adjudicated in ways that minimize the influence of personal factors behind those claims. Blind peer review, with all its well-documented limitations, is an obvious example of this. Reputable journals do not typically publish articles unless they have been vetted by independent experts who evaluate the contribution anonymously. Requirements for reproducibility of data and sharing are additional examples of the spirit of impartial and open competition. For a knowledge claim to count as scientific fact, it needs to be verified independently of the person claiming it. Recent methodological innovations associated with the open science movement, such as research pre-registration and adversarial collaboration, illustrate the capacity of the scientific community to evolve in ways that further insulate knowledge claims from the distorting influences of human bias. It follows from the principle of intersubjective competition that scholarly pursuits benefit from wide representation. When it comes to social, health, and behavioral sciences, it is particularly important to include scholars with native understanding of the subject matter. At the same time, a truly open discourse should also include dispassionate perspectives from outsiders with no personal stakes in the matter. Disinterestedness, by the way. Indeed, it is the combination of experiential and positional knowledge that often leads to the most fruitful insights. Moreover, it is entirely realistic to assume that if individuals with remarkably similar biographies may have fundamental disagreements about the topic at hand. Thus, to manage the undue influence of positionality among people who contribute to the research literature, the research community should focus on the integrity of the process where contributions are evaluated, published, and taught. So, in other words, that's all to say that we already have a way to make sure things are unbiased. Essentially, arguing that this is really unnecessary to begin with. The final thing is about positionality statements being a threat to some of the integrity going on here. And I promise I'm going to wrap this up here in a minute. Because positionality statements are, by definition, disclose information about the author's personal characteristics, this practice violates a fundamental tenet of the scientific value system, or should we say the normative principles of science. Universalism, the expectation that scholarship should be judged according to its own merits, independent of the status or identity of the person responsible for the contribution. Which is why I don't read positionality statements. Which is why I don't look at the authors' names. Which is why I don't look up which university the author's at. Which is why I don't look for a photo. Which is why I don't do this. This is the point we're making of this. By providing a positionality statement, if you believe so heavily in your notions with it that it gives you expressed experiences and what have you, by providing that, and if you believe that everybody else has their own internal implicit biases too, are you not also biasing the readers one way or another, potentially? You're giving information to bias the reader against you or for you. That's one of the reasons I don't like them. That's one of the reasons I don't look for any identifying information. I refuse to do it myself when I do reviews of anything. I was like with these authors, I have no idea what they look like. I have no idea where they are. I didn't even read those lines. Didn't even read the author's names. I couldn't tell you with this one. Although I think I see a last name, but even then I have no idea who these people are. It doesn't matter. That's not important. To appreciate the importance of the norm of universalism, consider the opposite, particularism. Family is an example of a social institution that demands particularism because parents are supposed to take special interest in the care and development of their own children. It would be deviant for a father to ignore his own son, even if he thought another boy in the neighborhood were, say, more coachable. Although we as academics also have our favored theories and preferred students, it would be completely inappropriate for us to accept manuscripts for publication or to fund research grants on the basis of such personal considerations. A key reason why science works and makes occasional progress is because researchers are expected to set those kinds of considerations aside and let the work speak for themselves. Peer review is once more a tangible example of this principle. The process is blinded so that reviewers pay attention only to the content and quality of the contribution. Now, one thing I do want to make a point on with this is I do think peer review should be double-blind. It is not always the case that peer review is double-blind. I do believe it should be. Manuscripts are or should be evaluated according to the quality of scholarship, independently of the author's identity or reputation in the field. Accordingly, membership in a particular group does not give an author personal authority over a truth claim and therefore should not be taken into consideration in evaluating scholarship. This is the point that cuts against positionality. Because one of the things they say with positionality here is that if you have certain positionality, you have certain things in your background, you have special knowledge. What he is just pointing out is that the particular thing about science here is that science, nobody has personal authority over a truth claim. It doesn't matter what your position in society is. That doesn't give you special authority over a claim of truth. The fact that peer-reviewed process does not always live up to these ideals does not mean the practice should be abandoned. It means it should be improved. For example, Nature Communications is moving toward transparent peer review, which means the journal will publish the exchanges between the authors and reviewers for all research articles accepted for publication. Yes, actually have seen that starting to happen more and more also. Yes, there are bad actors in science. The solution to this problem is increased transparency of the research process and more reliable enforcement of the norms of science. As documented earlier, it is typical for positionality statements to offer biographical details about the authors. It is not difficult to imagine situations in which such information might create bias in the review process. First, it may affect which manuscripts go out for review. Editors of scholarly journals appear to be under growing pressure to publish articles by authors from underrepresented groups. Including positionality statement in the manuscript provides an opportunity for the authors to signal their individual characteristics to the gatekeepers of the peer review process. In fact, increasing the representation of particular identities appears to be an implied goal of people who advocate for the use of positionality statements. For example, the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships offers two justifications for why authors should include positionality statements. The first is based on the journal's commitment to equity and inclusion, and the second justification is to promote transparency about the identity of authors and the extent to which those identities are represented and in the permanent scientific record. Question. If it's about the demographics side of things, why do you need the positionality statements when it's very easy for the journal to just have some information about the demographics privately or when authors submit? Anyway. By allowing authors to include subjective information about their personal characteristics, positionality statements erode the norm of universalism and introduce additional bias into the editorial process. Indeed. That's the reason I don't like them. That's the reason I won't touch them. One of the biggest reasons, not to mention they are kind of futile, as this author's already pointed out. Second, disclosing information about authors may influence the quality of reviews. For example, a manuscript dealing with the topic of sexual violence might be treated differently if depending on the reviewer's information about the author's gender, sexual orientation, and history of trauma. Blind peer review was instituted for a reason, and requiring or encouraging positionality statements undermines that reason. Third, positionality statements create a perverse incentive for authors to present themselves in ways that improve their chances of success. For example, if they think a particular identity or a lived experience will enhance their standing in the eyes of an editor or reviewer, authors will be more likely to recall or report events that will serve this purpose. The push for positionality statements may generate temptations to exaggerate or even fabricate claims of this nature. Why I don't want it is because I actually do think positionality statements will make things more biased. And so I wanted to bring up this article just to mention it as a good example, and I think very interesting article. I don't entirely agree with everything in here. I unfortunately don't have time to get too much into it, but I do think it's great to see something like this pushing back against some of the stuff, which I do think positionality statements will actually bias the review and editorial process in publishing and in research. So I don't think it's appropriate. That's the biggest reason I won't do it, but there's 3 reasons in here that is worth reading into. That's it for now. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrienne. May you stay curious, everybody.